Welcome back. Okay. We're moving forward with this wonderful, fabulous workshop for allies and gender inclusion and specific to gender discrimination. So what I've done is the fabulous Kai is here with us, and she's going to share. We're going to riff on what does a gender inclusive culture even look like, and we're going to talk about what allies are missing, maybe what you aren't seeing. Like we talk about the sense of being able to, you can't solve a problem you can't see. So we're going to riff on that a little bit. So Kai, welcome. Thank you for being here with me. I really appreciate it. Do you want to go ahead and just give us a little roundabout of you? What's your story? Where are you from?
Yeah, so my story was I'm currently a student. I'm in my last year of the Sauder School of Business, and I actually came out. I started my gender transition while I was in the university, and I happened to be the only transgender person in the university, and I still am. So that was where my experiences were, where I was looking at the school and I was seeing all these statements being made about, we're such an inclusive school. We create this collaborative learning environment from everybody, and like these were the aspirations, right? But when it came to for gender diverse and around gender, the intent versus the action just wasn't there because I felt like a lot of people had no idea what they were supposed to be doing. And I would be walking through the school and being like, oh, that doesn't work. I remember the summer after I came out and I came back to school in my second year versus my first year, and then it was just suddenly like oh, nothing quite works for me anymore, right? From seeing it in first year and feeling very comfortable with everything versus seeing it in second year, and the facilities weren't adequate. The way that the teachers were approaching the topic wasn't really adequate. The student body didn't have any understanding or expectations or just awareness of it, right? And so that was the issue where suddenly I was like, okay, if I don't start raising these topics up, if I don't start, making a lot of noise and just creating a lot of things, nobody's ever going to figure that out. Which is always the issue sometimes with marginalized persons, where we kind of get put on on the spot for creating all the spaces for ourselves, in addition to the fact that I have to do my whole degree at the same time as everyone else. I have to like all the extra work that I had to do at the same time as everyone else, and I had to do all the advocating for myself. So that is where my story kind of comes in. And yeah, just on those things of what are allies missing, and then what were my experiences through that. So yeah.
Yeah, I get it. I totally get it. I was talking with my son today. We're both neurodivergent. I'm dyslexic. He's ADHD. And we were just talking about how the world wasn't built for neurodiversity, and how many times you go into an environment and you're like rapid fire trying to adapt to the way that they offer the information to you, whether it's directions. We've gone into a hospital today is what it was. And the person with the directions spoke super fast, was just like as if we'd been there before. And my dyslexic brain couldn't put it together. It was too
Mhm.
fast and it was too many lefts and rights. And I was like, doop, 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 doop. Like I just couldn't do it. I ended up looking at my son and being like, you got this. Like, I did not get any of that. So I get this sense. And that's the context of like, it doesn't fit if you don't fit
Mhm.
the status quo. And
Mhm.
so when we talk about gender discrimination, it's amplified into this space of like the harm that it actually does. I mean, the impact from it. So when you see or think of, or you look towards the future, like what does an gender inclusive culture look like to you? Like what is it that you walk in, if you walked into an ideal school setting, what sort of things would you be seeing and feeling inside the?
I think one of the easiest things, like just the very base level, there's an interesting conversation about facilities, right? I think that is something that really starts the situation or just starts the context when I can go into a space and feel like I don't have to use the facility differently, right? Because the building that was designed for the solder building wasn't designed for non-binary people. There was only two, maybe three, uh, all gender washrooms in the entire building, right? And so whereas people would say, okay, we'll just run to the washroom and be back there. Like my second year when I was non-binary, it was like, yeah, my closest washroom is like 7 minutes away, right? It's hard for me to just go to class and get out. And these are the things that, for a lot of cisgender folk, you know, doesn't stick, right? Because they've never had to go through that. They've never had to spend that extra time or worry about it, right? And so obviously it's not easy to just be like redesign the building. Although Solder's putting a new building up, and I have put a lot of words in being like, this can't, like, you can't do this wrong, like at this point, right? The new building like has to be done right from the start. So that's one thing. But some other things could be involved, like even just maps, right? So that students don't like. I had to go and like do a treasure hunt to find the gender all gender washrooms when I first came out, right? And had to go find them because nobody knew where they were. There was no map that was created for it. There was nothing like that, and so I got to go and find them. So that's one thing on this like sort of facilities front. A lot of the other things come down to things like forms, like where surveys, where there's a lot of instances where, you know, even these researchers, these university academic researchers, and students would be creating forms and surveys for people to fill out. And it would always, at first it would just be like, man, woman, prefer not to answer. And then it was like one step up, it was like man, woman, other, right? And so
Yeah,
slowly
yeah.
things have been slowly getting better on that front. But that's just the awareness that a lot of even the professors don't know the proper ways to do it. And they don't have any of the resources to set this up. And for a lot of them, they don't have the drive to do it because, I am the only trans person there. So I've only
Mm,
had so many professors, and those professors were immediately like, "Oh shit, this isn't working." Right? We
mhm,
gotta fix this. Like we gotta go and do our own learning. But for everyone
mhm,
else that didn't have that contact with me, right? Like that didn't happen. That conversation didn't happen, and that kind of clicking in their brains didn't happen. And so that's something, just going back to like, what does a gender inclusive culture look like? Isn't even before we get there, it's cis allies need to really go and start doing some of that work themselves. Go and uh, read the stories. Go and watch the TV. Even just watching media, watching TV shows, learning about that, and then thinking about themselves, like in which one of my practices am I making assumptions behind gender? Or in which one of my practices am I, accidentally separating things? Am I saying, boys on one side, girls on the other side, right? Or like, are we splitting things up by gender? Well, we really don't need to.
mhm.
And so that's the kind of when I think of gender inclusive culture, it's like not only do we need to build new things that are responsive and inclusive of non-binary people, but really unpack the ways that we really don't need to be gendering things to begin with.
Say more words. What does that look like? Like, where are you seeing spaces? Okay, so I'll just like add a little bit of context here too,
Mhm.
is that like for the audience who come from the corporate realm, there's a
Mhm.
lot. It's
Yeah.
higher education is problematic. We know that, and they're at a
Mhm.
there's certain pace of growth happening in there. At the corporate level, it's faster. So people
Mhm.
who are in the corporate sphere are probably like, yeah, we've addressed these sorts of things, and yeah, we are working on that. And then the small business realm, it's this set, and I do a lot of this in my consulting, that onboarding piece and making sure that
Mhm.
the knowledge gaps are filled at the point of entry so that someone coming into the organization, it's like starting there and making sure that you've got gender inclusive language at the point of contact and then working that pathway out as far as someone would go into an organization. So like for you, onboarding into the school, okay, what are your touch points, what are your contact
Mhm.
points, is it gender inclusive all through the whole
Mhm.
narrative like that? And it's interesting, this piece about the segregation, the bathrooms made
Yeah.
me think of, segregation back in the day where it was whites only, blacks only, right? But the bathroom for the black community would be forever away. So you're
Mhm.
experiencing discrimination along the same lines as racial oppression was in generations past. It's moved around. That perspective really
Mhm.
really hits with me.
Yeah. So kind of to take that into the corporate world, one of the ways, or just an example where this idea of gender can be pervasive even in places that we don't think, very subtle things, like for example, the scheduling, right? When we schedule meetings, when we schedule like flex time, parental benefits, family benefits, how are those benefits being constructed, right? Is there an expectation of who's using it? For example, if say that there is a like a weekly meeting that happens every Monday morning or a certain time. but those things conflict with, say, when you'd have to pick up the kids, right? And so now people like, who is picking up the kids like that, they're being excluded on that, even though there wasn't the conversation or gender wasn't a factor when we were thinking about that, right? It becomes a point of who is being more affected by these systems, right? Right? What are the, you know, the traits that we ascribe to being more feminine, being more masculine, and how do we even like how do we prioritize those things? When we do performance reviews, when we do we evaluate people on their ability in like on the different things that they're supposed to be performing on, right? What are those performance metrics, right? Are they, for example, prioritizing people who are very like assertive, very loud, very dominating, like in certain contexts, right? The and is that really working for people of all gender, right? Because when I think about gender inclusion, especially sort of feminism moving forward, is what I see a lot of the time is women's empowerment is this idea of we should enable women to be like men, we to be like what men are expected to be traditionally, right? Very loud, very assertive, very confident, and sort of taking their stand, asserting their views, not being so collaborative, but being, you know, this sort of masculine archetype of what a leader is supposed to look like, right? And even when we look at, you know, research behind this, where, you know, women who take that, you know, step even get perceived as being bossy versus men who take that, you know, get perceived as being, you know, strong leaders, right? And so there are these sorts of things when we work it into the way we evaluate things, the way we think about things, how we're prioritizing certain behaviors in our workplace that isn't really being done from a gendered lens. We're not saying like we're not trying to say like we want these masculine traits to be prioritized, but the way it ends up being is that certain traits, you know, are louder, certain traits are more obvious. And so then that kind of trickles down to, you know, what does the culture end up, how does the culture end up, you know, adopting that, right? That's how you get these like very toxic work cultures, right? When it's very competitive, right? I face that a lot in business school where there's very limited spots for things. And so it comes down to like, who has the loudest voice, who's able to, you know, really stand up in the classroom. In the classroom, they do a lot of participation marks, right? And so if you're confident, you're loud, you're assertive, and you raise your hand for everything, you're going to get 10 out of 10 on participation, which can be up to like 25% of your course grade. But if you're someone from another culture, maybe you're an international student whose English isn't your first language isn't English, maybe you're shyer, maybe you're more introverted, you just don't have that experience, you've never been taught for your life that, you know, this is what you're supposed to be like, suddenly you're being very literally marked down on traits that are not your fault for having, right? And so that is the ways that I think about the structural ways that these sorts of gendered systems can impact people at a very individual level.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we see this across corporate for sure. This is the standard of shifting that's happened is this space of being like new ways to evaluate. I've been
Mhm.
deep in those conversations with clients before and really been underneath this layer of how it's shifting and changing, and it's pretty marvelous to see. It takes creativity of
Mhm.
how what works for your organization, what works for your team, what works for your leadership style, you know, in order to create more inclusion around
Mhm.
that. Super interesting. So I wanted to ask you, because one of the things that we were talking about with just the idea of this workshop was like allies oftentimes, in my opinion, can't see discrimination. They don't really,
Mhm.
they can't identify it. They don't know what it looks like. In Nix's interview, they talk about, you know, about body language. That's one of the conversations we had, you know, and about trying to identify the physical of it. But what are you seeing as far as that allies aren't seeing? Like, are there specific spaces, or, you know, like when you're traveling through the world, where you're like allies just can't see this, like this is happening right in front of them and they 100% can't see it. Is there anything from there that maybe you could offer perspective
Yeah.
on?
So one, I think the body language piece is a really good one. One of the things that, like almost the easiest thing that allies can do, especially when interacting with trans folks or non-binary folks, is really just helping take that step to if someone misgenders someone else, or the thing, or yeah, if they get misgendered in like a conversation or a meeting or things like that, just be gentle and just say something. It's like, oh, sorry, I think you meant, them, right? I think you meant this name, right? So that's one thing where maybe people are noticing it, but they're not stepping up to do it for whatever reason. Maybe they don't feel comfortable stepping up. Maybe they don't feel like it's their place to step up. Um, and a lot of those things, right? Really, you can do a lot just by asking someone, what are the best ways that I can support you? Is there any way that I can take some of this weight off your shoulders from doing things? Can I advocate for you in certain spaces, right? Because when it comes down to, like, what are allies missing? A lot of the time, different non-binary people are going to have very diverse needs, right? There's people who are trans masculine, people who are trans feminine. As a trans feminine person, I often, like, now it's better because I traditionally pass a little bit better. But when I was still in that early stage of my transition, I would face like sort of prejudice language where people would say things that would make me sort of question my womanhood, like question my femininity in that sort of sense. And that's something that's going to be very different from how people are facing that versus a trans man and the issues that he's going to go through. Whereas, maybe with conversations about top surgery or trans men who have not had top surgery, right, going into these spaces. But the body language piece, definitely an important one. Just asking, really taking the step up, especially if there's someone in your organization who is non-binary, just ask them, what are the best ways I can support you? What is unique to you? What are the things that are happening there? I'm trying to think about in terms of what I've seen missed for me. Uh, Actually, one thing that I think is very relevant for trans people that a lot of allies don't know is Trans Day of Remembrance. So Trans Day of Remembrance happens in November, and it's a day that sort of commemorates the death of a lot of trans people throughout history, usually, oftentimes in violent, in yeah, under violence. And so I remember in my school, that period of time was very sensitive for me because I was doing a lot of work to try and get people to be aware of what this day was. I was doing a lot of work to write about it, to talk about it, to share, and to do these types of things. And I didn't even realize how emotionally that was affecting me until I got to the point where and I was being asked to do a lot of things, additionally take on a lot of work responsibilities and do all these things on top of this really emotionally sensitive time, this really emotionally sensitive work that I was doing. And even though I was telling people about this, like, I'm doing a lot of Trans Day of Remembrance stuff, I'm doing a lot of these things, that didn't click for them. That didn't click for them that, I'm advocating for, or I'm doing a lot of work around the death of people in my community. But then they would come out, yeah, but we still need you to do all these things. Like, we're still going to put these responsibilities on you. We're still going to put these things on you. And I didn't, I had a bit of a breakdown at that point. And I think only after I had that breakdown, then the people around me and my teams and things were just like, oh yeah, that is a pretty heavy topic to be thinking about. That is a pretty heavy thing to be dealing with for like a good week, So that's another situation where there are particularly sensitive times. For example, this weekend is Pride, and I actually recently just got COVID, and so I won't even be able to attend Pride. And that is a really, it was a really sensitive thing for me, where, I've been waiting so long to attend this, and I won't be able to, right? But for someone who isn't trans or isn't LGBTQ, they don't understand the weight that these days hold for us. They don't understand just the additional punch that it has, right? And so being aware of what's going on around those times, right? Because for us, like, Pride for me is so much more important than Christmas, right? All these are our kind of days of celebration. These are our days of commemoration. And so being aware of that and kind of giving that the same weight to a trans person, to an LGBTQ person, the same you would give to someone for their own religious holidays, that can be a really, really important thing to think of, that, a lot of allies don't quite get.
Yeah, no, it's true. That's a big part of my consulting, my business consulting, is looking at the calendar. and like organizing operations to suit the calendar of religion, LGBTQ2S plus, Black History, all of, all Indigenous History Month, like all of these things working into the calendar. So you're sensitive to it. So you're aware of it. So it's not like, oh, that's today. So you're actually doing things to nurture and support and intentionally not putting extra weight on the people who are part of the communities that are
Hmm.
meant to be celebrated. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's super fundamental, super fundamental. So how do you see allies being more actionable then? So when if they're like, they're out there, they're trying, they're figuring out, they're working on their implicit bias, they're starting to understand more and more about themselves, and maybe, questioning like the conversation Matthew and I had of like how much of your thinking is really your thinking, and like all of these
Hmm.
conversations that we've had over the course of this workshop. What's your sort of piece? How do you feel like when you think of allies? How could they be more actionable? I know we talked about some
Yeah.
stuff as far as like, a few little touch points, but maybe some final thoughts on that.
Hmm. In terms of actionable items, things that people can actually start doing, practicing, right? When for things like pronoun usage and even things like going out of your way to support and advocate for things, thinking it through it. So let's start with the pronouns. Practicing is such an important thing to do, right? A lot of people cognitively will be aware of like, okay, I know this person, I know what their pronouns are cognitively, but you have so many years of assumptions like laden into your brain where you kind of you get a perception of what people sound like or look like, and you don't even think about it. The pronoun, the incorrect pronoun just sort of falls out, and suddenly you didn't realize it, or someone calls you out, and then you're like, well, well, how did I do that? Like, I know what your pronouns are. I know what this is. The reality is it's just about practicing, right? Putting a sticky note on your laptop, and every time you look over it, you just like, yeah, Kai, she, they pronouns. Kai, she, they pronouns. They have they, them pronouns, and she also uses. Just practice getting that into the muscle memory and not relying on your cognitive awareness of bias, but really drilling that down into your practical action against your bias, right? Because it's one thing to be aware of your biases, but it's a totally different thing to actually work to build a new, like a new neural pathway that'll take you out of those biases, right?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Pronouns are tricky for me, and it really has much less to do with bias and more to do with neurodiversity and being
Mm-hmm.
dyslexic. So I miss pro, like I'll mess pro, I mess them up all the time. And it's not even like I used to really beat myself up about it, because I'd be like, get it through your head, how do you not know this? Like, this is what you do for a living and you're still getting it wrong. And then I realized it's not, it's the dyslexia for me. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's the switches it. I can have a conversation with somebody's mother and say he.
Mm.
Like, I can, it's just I know my kids pronouns. Hello. My
Yeah.
son's transgender, my other child's non-binary, and I'll still mix it up. And I
Mm-hmm.
realize it's got, for me personally, and for anybody else, especially if you're dyslexic out there, is I want to offer a sense of grace around the learning experience, because it's one thing to
Mm-hmm.
say just keep practicing and practicing and practicing, but if you're neurodivergent, um, it's not necessarily a matter of practice as it is. It's just
It's
your brain is going to, there's a moment where and just to give yourself grace in that sense too.
mm-hmm. And that comes down to the giving yourself grace and also learning and knowing how to recover from those
Yeah,
situations. Like if you
so
get
easy.
and that's the thing where if someone gets my pronouns wrong, but they recover gracefully, right? They get called out and they again not flipping the harm where suddenly I don't have to kind of coddle them and be like, no, no, it's okay, right? If someone's able to understand and take that away quickly and follow with grace, that's perfectly fine. The
Yeah,
For me, it comes down to just having a lot of folks where I have had experiences with folks where they don't put that practice in, or they don't, they just feel like, okay, I learned it once, I should get it, right?
yeah,
But the only time that they're putting that action into practice is when they're dealing with a transgender person, and there's just not that many around. There's just not that many of us around. So if you only put that practice in every time you deal with a trans person, you're not actually going to have the repertoire of practice that you would have. And this is actually something that I'm working on at a research project right now with the Sauder School of Business, which is contact with people, contact with trans people, just contact with an out group in general is one of the strongest ways to reduce prejudice, right?
Mm.
However, with trans people, there's not a lot of us, so it's hard to have meaningful contact. It's hard to have, it's just hard to find us and meet us and have those conversations where, you'll have that prejudice reduction effect. But what I'm sort of studying and what I'm hoping to find and is that so even just imagining that contact for yourself, if you think about a situation where, okay, I want to imagine myself coming into contact with a trans person, coming into contact with a non-binary person, running through that sort of script where I'm like, okay, how am I going to act? How do I feel about these situations, right? Even just imagining that and putting yourself in those future situations, like if you're working with a non-binary person and you're going to go have a meeting with them, just thinking about that meeting in your head before you go, like, okay, I'm going to go meet with them. I want to make sure that I'm using their pronouns correctly. I'm going to get their name correct, and just imagining that situation before you go into that will kind of prime you so much better for when things happen that you're sort of better prepared for that.
Mm. Yeah, I get it. I totally get it. And like Matthew says, it's like Matthew uses they them pronouns for
Mhm.
most folk until he knows better.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
kind of the way of it, is just kind of, like that was the season I went through where I just they them a lot until it became super normal. Not normal,
Mhm.
that's the wrong word for it, but it became more of a habit for me to they them.
Mhm.
And then all I had to do was branch off, and kind
Yeah.
of explore from that. But yeah, that's
Mhm.
helpful. That's
The
super
way
helpful.
the way I say that was like swapping your default pronoun to they them is actually a really great strategy because then you're really removing that assumption of assuming what someone's gender is unless you have real information, right? If
Yeah.
maybe you hear them getting gendered by one of their friends, right? And you go, oh, okay, so that person used she her pronouns for her and it looked okay, like now I have information, right? So I'm
Mm-hmm.
not making the assumption, but I'm actually being informed by what's going on around me, right? I use they them pronouns until I ask someone what are your pronouns? And then they give me their pronouns, like, okay, now I know, right? Now I
Mm-hmm.
know. And so removing your ability to make the gendered assumption from the outset, and then only gendering people based on, tangible information that you've received, right? That's another really great way to start unraveling the ways that we tend to assume gender from people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's my favorite is the burn down the binary. It doesn't need to be there in the first
Mhm.
place. Yeah,
Exactly.
doesn't need to be there in the first place. I also just want to make a note that I know that we were using the language in this conversation around call out, and so there are
Mm,
people out here like myself who don't use the language of call out. We use the language of
mm,
call in. So if you're
mhm,
watching this
mhm,
interview and you're kind of hearing that and being like, "Oh, what's with call out?" That's you get to choose in that
mhm.
realm. But I also want to acknowledge that call in is is uh
Yes.
is amazing in its own
Mhm.
context. So what else, Kai, it has been lovely to have you here. I really, really appreciate you sharing your time with us. Do you have any other final thoughts when it comes to gender discrimination and allyship and charging them into action? Anything that you sort of want to leave us with?
It has been something that you've mentioned and has been touched on through various interviews already, but don't be afraid of the fear, right? Don't
Mm-hmm.
be afraid of really just standing up and saying something and making that mistake, right? Because at the end of the day, especially for myself, when I see someone trying, that means so much more, even if they get it wrong, than just sort of standing back and be like, I don't want to make the mistake, so I'm not even going to try and help, right? And so that is something where I've had situations in the past where nobody knew what to do, so they didn't try to help. And the one person that took that extra step, I was like, hey, I don't really know what to do, but I just want to let you know that I'm here for you. If there's anything that I can help with, or if there's anything that you need, just let me know. And that was like, I'm so happy that you said that because so many people just sort of watched this happen and didn't even say anything. So I know that
Mm-hmm.
you had no idea what to do, but at least I know that you thought about it and that you thought that I should try, right? And so that
Yeah,
is like, don't be afraid of that.
that's creating belonging environments. inclusive
Exactly.
environments. But that's it, is
Exactly.
you saw them. And if you see
Hmm.
them, acknowledge acknowledge
Yeah.
them. It's also how you break down bias. It's how you dismantle bias, but that acknowledge piece and leaning into it and kind of engaging
Hmm.
with it. Amazing, wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. I really, really appreciate it. You'll find information on Kai all around this interview, wherever it was that you found the workshop, and connect with her on LinkedIn. Her website's out there for you, and we look forward to seeing you in the next interview.
Absolutely.
Bye, Kai.
Bye.